The Rousseau Gambit now has the highest win rate for black in this position. Once considered a joke, it's now dominating. Here's your complete guide to master it. Let's go. We'll cover the most difficult responses later, but let's start with the most common one. White captures on f5. That's a mistake, because now you can push pawn to a4, attacking their knight on f3. Notice that all the forward escape squares for the knight are controlled by your pawns and pieces. In most games, white retreats the knight back to g1, which is obviously great for you. Now you play knight to f6, developing your piece while also securing the h5 square. Next, no matter what white plays, you go pawn to d5, gaining another tempo by attacking their bishop. After this, you can develop your own bishop with tempo and easily regain your sacrificed f5 pawn. This sequence already shows how effectively you've outplayed your opponent. At this point, most of your opponents will kindly allow you to centralize your knight, which is great for you. Then, you develop your dark squared bishop, putting pressure on the c2 pawn, and prepare to castle kingside. Your position becomes very active. You dominate the center, and your knight exerts pressure all around the board. If white tries to trade pieces, you don't follow the usual path. Instead, you capture the pawn on f2, exposing their king. Then you bring in your knight like an octopus, creating multiple threats. Now comes the fun part. Don't underestimate your rook, as it often helps finish the attack and win the game. If white refuses to retreat their knight and instead tries to pin your e4 pawn while attacking it, you play a simple symmetric move, developing your queen to unpin the pawn, keeping the pressure. Now their knight is still hanging and must retreat, giving you more time to continue development. White might try to play pawn to d3, hoping you'll capture and allow them to trade queens, aiming for a simplified position. But instead, you strike with knight to d4, a much stronger move, attacking the queen and the pawn on c2 at the same time. When white moves their queen, whether to d1 or d2, it doesn't really matter. You go ahead and sacrifice your knight on c2 anyway. After that, you deliver a discovered check, putting white's king under pressure once again. Of course, your opponent doesn't have to follow this exact line, but that's the beauty of your position. You have multiple attacking ideas, and it's very difficult for white to stop them all. Let's say white avoids the blunder pawn to d3 and instead plays knight to c3. You still go knight to d4, hitting the queen and the pawn on c2. To defend both, they're often forced to retreat the queen all the way back to d1, a familiar pattern of their pieces returning to their starting positions while you gain space and activity. Now your position is dominant, and you can increase the pressure by sacrificing the pawn on d5. Although it's technically defended by two pawns, this is a well-calculated sacrifice. After the trade, you bring out your light-squared bishop with threats like pushing pawn to e3, opening the long diagonal, and setting up tactics such as knight takes c2 or queen to c5. You continue the pressure by attacking the bishop and the pawn on c2, with threats like castling queenside to bring your rook into the attack. You have many powerful options at this stage. If white captures on b7, no problem. You simply move your rook and keep the attack going. One common mistake white makes is playing knight to e2, which looks natural but is actually a blunder. You respond with bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the queen. There's no solid defense. You're going to win the knight, then the queen, and white collapses. Another defensive try is pawn to c3, hoping you'll retreat your knight. But instead, you surprise them with knight to f3, delivering a check. Then comes yet another discovered check, this time from your queen, adding to the chaos. White's king has no safe moves. If it tries to run, say to e2, you respond with bishop to d3, and checkmate is only a few moves away. If they sacrifice the knight, you don't capture immediately. Instead, you play a brilliant shot, bishop to c2, offering your bishop to distract the queen. If queen captures bishop, you finish the game crushing queen takes a 2 and a winning attack. If your opponent gears up for the Italian game, surprise them with pawn to f5. Shocked, they capture, but you strike back with pawn to a4, attacking the knight on f3. Should the knight retreat, you have two strong continuations. Knight to f6, a solid, safe move that reinforces the e4 square. Pawn to d5, a provocative thrust that asks, care to pull your bishop back and start over? Irritated, white may try to punish you with queen to h5 check. No worries. Calmly stepping your king to a7. The bishop on c4 still needs to move, and you immediately activate another piece with knight to d4, renewing the attack. If the queen retreats, you recapture the stolen f5 pawn and enjoy a superior position. If the queen insists on guarding that pawn, you counter with pawn h6, queen to g6, piling on the pressure. Finally, knight to d4 joins the fray, adding yet another attacker and leaving white struggling to hold everything together. Now bishop takes f5 becomes a serious threat, so white tries to hold the pawn with pawn to g4. No problem, you simply develop your light-squared bishop to a better square, keeping your attack going. After almost any move from white, you'll be kind enough to finish the game quickly, sending them off to bed with a loss. But what if your opponent avoids the trap and calmly retreats the bishop, say to b5? You still maintain pressure with queen to g5, targeting the pawn on g2. Since white can't castle kingside, they struggle to defend this pawn. Often white will trade on c6, but that doesn't change much. The g2 pawn still hangs, and moving the king keeps it exposed. If white plays pawn to g3, it weakens all the light squares, giving you an easy long-term target. Eventually, you'll pick up the g2 pawn and continue developing with a dominant position. A more ambitious defense is pawn to g4, guarding both f5 and g2. On the surface, it looks solid, until you spring your trap. You sacrifice your bishop on f5, then bring your knight and queen forward. There's no defense, your pieces swarm in, you grab the rook, and soon after, you finish the game with a decisive attack. To be fair, we can't really blame white. They didn't make obvious mistakes. They just didn't do anything meaningful. But if you're facing a stronger opponent, they might try the tricky knight to d4, sacrificing the knight to create complications. You have options. But more seriously, you ignore the sacrifice and keep developing with knight to f6. You don't take the knight right away, because you want to first cover potential checks. Now that the h5 square is protected, the knight on d4 is truly hanging. After white trades and you recapture, nothing changes dramatically. You still gain control of the center, push back the bishop, recover your sacrificed pawn, and end up with a very active, aggressive position, while white has gained nothing. You keep developing your pieces, castle kingside, and now you're ready to launch your kingside attack. If white is hoping to get tactical, you say, sure, let's go, and bring the heat. You can sacrifice the bishop, bring your queen forward, grab a central pawn, and then castle to safety. With white's king exposed, you gain full attacking rights. For example, you might sacrifice the bishop again. This time, the g-pawn can't take because it's pinned, and if they try anything else, it's checkmate anyway. So far, we've looked at white's most common response, pawn takes f5, accepting your gambit. But what if they try something flashier, like bishop takes rook on g8? At first glance, it looks great for white, since you lose the right to castle kingside, but in reality, it's no big deal. You can castle queenside later, and more importantly, white just gave up their only active piece. Meanwhile, your pawn on e4 is still hanging. If white grabs it, they fall into the same trap. After you push pawn to a4, their knight must retreat, and you get to continue attacking just as before. You calmly block the queen check, and then, as always, go pawn to d5. Setting up bishop takes f5. White, feeling bold, plays queen to h5, threatening both your king and the h7 pawn. But that's exactly what you were hoping for. You reply with pawn to g6, and after they trade queens, your rook becomes active along the g-file. Now white grabs the h7 pawn, thinking they've broken your kingside and are on the attack. What they don't realize is this. The opening they're playing is secretly called Oops, I Blundered. You respond with queen to g5, threatening both the g2 pawn and the rook on h1. If white tries to defend that pawn, you follow up with rook to h6, and suddenly, white's queen is trapped. The attack is over, and you're the one in control.